good things get spoiled. That's the story of humanity. God's solution to that is not to constantly interfere, that basically turned over to us, Jesus' followers, the ones who are now to present that goodness of God and to reverse the spoiled part, to demonstrate to the world what God had in mind with this planet.
The Apostle Paul said that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. Today we're going to talk about two things that we don't usually think about together, and that's disappointment and grace. There are some of you who right now are disappointed in your own lives with God. Some of you are disappointed with the church. Some of you are disappointed with the way that your lives are going, or the way the world is going. And some of you are in a place right now where you're starting to wonder, is the gracious God that I've read about and that I've sung about really there, when you see a picture that's very different, often in different places? So we're going to talk about that with somebody I've been learning about these things from for many, many, many years, literally since I was a teenager reading his column, and that is Philip Yancey. Many of you have read the classics that he has written. There's not often that a single book will persist over years and years and years being read, much less a whole series of them. He has written a number of those, such as Where is God When It Hurts? What's So Amazing About Grace? The Jesus I Never Knew. A little book that I have that might have been among the first Philip Yancey books I ever read, Open Windows, series of essays. One of the most accomplished and widely read Christian writers of the last 50 years, to be sure. Philip Yancey, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you, Russell.
You know, as Michael Scott on The Office said, I'm not superstitious, but I'm a little stitious. And one of the superstitions that I've found myself having is I always have a little bit of a check when I start to teach out of the book of Job. Because I think, if I start to teach out of Job, does that mean that God's going to say, okay, well, let's test that? And I know rationally that that's ridiculous, but there's something kind of at the under the surface level that tends to say that. You have written on hurt, on the gift of pain, on those sorts of things, and now, over the past couple of years, you've had to go through quite a bit of suffering with recovering from cancer, dealing with Parkinson's, those sorts of things. I'm wondering, as you're facing all of these multiple challenges at once, did you ever start to think, maybe I would have answered these questions differently now than I did before?
Actually, Russell, I think I did it in the right order. What doesn't work so well is when suddenly you're hit with an illness or something that's life-threatening, and you go to the local seminary library and check out a bunch of books on the problem of pain, and you're lying there just affected by the disease, by whatever is wrong with you, and that's not a good time to think about the theodicy.
Yeah.
The time to think about it is when you're healthy, and to prepare and to figure out some of those things before they hit. And I'm glad you mentioned the book of Job, because on the one hand, it's the most complete treatment of suffering and God's involvement in pain in this world. On the other hand, it avoids most of the issues we want to talk about.
Right.
And scholars say it may be the oldest story in the Bible. And I find that quite encouraging, because a lot of people think, well, you can't really get mad at God. You can't lash out at God. You have to be respectful. And they should read the book of Job. Job came just as close as you can possibly come to doing what his wife recommended: curse God and die. He didn't curse God. He wished he could die. In fact, he wished that he had never been born. He said that again and again to God in his talks. And I have respect for a God who not only understands what we are going through, and of course became a human being on this earth and learned in person what it's like here, but gives us the words we can use in lamenting. Job would say, "You just don't know what you're doing, God. You're not fair. It's unjust." And his friends, his properly trained theologian friends, were scandalized. "Job, you can't say things like that to God." Well, one lesson from the book of Job is you can say things like that to God. God has big shoulders. And there's a beautiful twist at the end of the book where God says, "Okay, Job, we need to straighten a few things out, and then I'll deal with your friends, but I'll only listen to them if they speak through you. If you pray for them, then maybe I'll pay some attention to them." And these were the theologian friends, and they thought they had everything neatly buttoned down, but they obviously didn't. And God instead honored the one who lamented and wailed and cried and questioned God.
There was somebody that said recently, it might have even been in our book club that we're in on Wednesday nights, going through the book of Job one time. There was somebody who was relatively new to the text of Job, and who said, I really found it disappointing, but not because it didn't answer the questions, as you're mentioning now, but more because it seems to, at the end, kind of give a happy ending. Job has all of these things restored to him, and so it almost felt. This person said, I don't want to say this about the Bible, but it seemed kind of like a cheap ending to it, almost like a prosperity gospel sort of narrative. How do you read that?
Well, there are a lot of scholars who believe that it was added on, that ending was added on, wasn't part of the original story. I had read the book many times before I noticed something, Russell, that may speak to that, and I'm not sure. But at the end of the book, Job has restored to him double of what he had before. So if he had 7,000 camels, now he's got 14,000 camels and sheep, and God goes down the list until you get to his children. And then he originally had 10 children, they all died, and he got not 20 children, but 10 children. He got his children back, as it were. And that may be God's way of saying, some things don't last forever, but Job, your children do last forever. And I know it must have been a terrible, crushing wound in your family to lose those that you love. But I assure you, you'll get them back someday. And, I haven't seen that talked about very much, but it just stood out to me when I first noticed the math involved in that last chapter.
It seems to me there are a couple of different kinds of people that you would have had to have talked about these issues of pain and suffering and disappointment over the years. I can think of at least two categories. One of them being the person who's going through suffering, and you're trying to figure out how to give this person comfort and hope without cliches, the sorts of things that might sound like the friends of Job to people. And the other might be the person who, whether he or she's ever suffered or not, is sort of looking around like Ivan Karamazov at the suffering in the world and saying, how could there be a good and all-powerful God when we see babies starving to death and these sorts of awful pain that doesn't seem to resolve itself out into a happy ending like part of Job is. How do you speak to those two different kinds of people?
Well, the second group is often represented by the new atheists, and actually the old atheists too.
Yeah.
There was a major crisis of faith in the Christian West in 1755 when there was an earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and it was on a Christian holiday. I think it was the All Saints' Day, and I forget how many, 30,000 people I think were killed. And Voltaire and other atheists just jumped on that and said, how can you worship a God that allows that at a time when people are gathered to celebrate him, to worship him? And it's a very good question. And again, later, people phrased it in different ways. So I think it was Sam Harris, one of the new atheists, who said, I would become a believer if we just had a stadium of 100,000 people and somebody would come and show us a miracle that actually happened. How about an arm that was missing and grows back? If that happened, I would become a believer right away. Mm. And when I think about the question they're asking, what they're really saying is, I wish that God interacted with this planet in a different way than God does. I wish that God was fair and made sure that everything was fair. So if a person does evil, they should be punished right away. And if a person does good, they should be rewarded. Instead, you've got, as Job points out, you've got evil people who prosper, and you've got good people who are punished, seemingly. And it goes back to what kind of world God wanted. And God evidently did not want a world where God is constantly intervening, straightening things out, punishing every little sin that comes along, and rewarding every little good thing. That clearly is not the kind of world that God wants. And at the same time, as we can see in Jesus, Jesus had the opportunity to go around and heal all the world's diseases, presumably. I mean, he's God. He's got the connections, even though he's here on earth as a human being. He did heal people, several hundred, maybe 1,000 people, but he didn't solve the problem of pain on planet Earth. In fact, I'll go even further and say he didn't do anything for the Americas continent. He didn't do anything for Europe. He didn't do anything for Asia. He only affected a small number, relatively small number of people in a corner of the Roman Empire, Judea, Galilee, those places. And he was quite happy. In fact, every time Jesus was asked, he responded with healing and compassion. Every time. He never said, well, go get some more faith and come back and then we can talk. But right now, you don't pass the test. So John, of course, used the word signs. These are signs of the new creation. It's like a preview of what God plans to do with the entire planet. It's important to emphasize both sides of the Christian view of this planet. In the brief words of C.S. Lewis, he said, it's a good thing spoiled. A good thing spoiled. My goodness, I see that. I love nature. I live in a beautiful state of Colorado, and I have been able to travel to many parts of the world. And I've seen the goodness of this earth and the goodness of people wherever I go. But it's spoiled. almost everything we try, whether it's a government or whether it's sexuality or addictions or good things, get spoiled. That's the story of humanity. And God's solution to that, as I understand, God's solution to that is not to constantly interfere. He basically turned over to us, Jesus' followers, the ones who are now to present that goodness of God and to reverse the spoiled part, to demonstrate to the world what God had in mind with this planet. So in a sense, we're looking at a work of art that has been trashed. You know, it's a painting with graffiti written on top of it. That's just an image of what the world may look like from outer space, this little planet. And I understand and respect more and more God's choices. He always seemed to tilt toward freedom. And I don't think God wanted to do everything by himself on this planet. That clearly was not his goal. His goal rather was to participate, to identify with us, to take on our own suffering, to experience it in God's own self, and then to turn it over to us, Jesus' followers, to go out and show the mercy. In fact, it's very clear. I wrote out this verse in 2 Corinthians 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. And I wish the people around us would see God as the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. Many do not. And he goes on to say, Paul goes on to say, who comforts us in all of our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. That's the pattern that Jesus set into motion. He said, I will indeed respond to the people who I happen to meet, and I've done that, as he did many places. But I'm not here to solve the problem of pain. I'm not here to deal with every person who's lost a child. Actually, I trust you with that job. If you get to know my Father, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort, then that can help equip you to be one of those comfort givers who understands and believes in and worships the Father of compassion and God of all comfort and spreads that comfort wherever you go. That's our job as the followers of Jesus. And I remember one time I was asked, I think it was on a secular radio program, Russell, somebody who said, well, let's see, where is God when it hurts? Interesting book you wrote here. Didn't have time to read it, sorry. But could you just answer that in a couple sentences? You know, you love those interviews, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for not being like that. And I was kind of taken aback. I hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, where is God when it hurts? I guess my one sentence answer would be, where is the church when it hurts? Because that's what we were called to do. We were called to spread abroad that comfort that we receive from the God of all comfort, the Father of compassion.
Well, think about, I mean, obviously we believe that God can and does answer prayer. We've seen people who, for instance, have gone through a time of sickness and have prayed for healing and have been healed. Mm-hmm. And then we've seen people who've gone through maybe the exact same kind of sickness. They also are praying, but they're not healed. Mm-hmm. What makes the difference between those two people from the perspective of God? Even if the church is responding the same way to both, and God seems to answer the one prayer and not the other, why would that be the case?
Yeah, you know, those why questions, they're very tricky and they can really mislead us. And in a lot of the world, as you know, the main understanding of those questions that is going on is the prosperity gospel. If you just do this, if you just follow this ritual, if you just give money to the church, then God will answer your prayer. God wants us something good for you. And of course, God wants us to flourish. That's clear. But it's also clear that you don't get an exemption from pain and suffering when you sign up to be a God follower, a Christ follower. And it's so tricky. There's a story from my own background. I didn't really understand this or know the facts behind it until I was, I think, 18 years old. My father died of polio in 1950. It was the major pandemic back then. 50 to 70,000, mostly children, per year were either dying or being paralyzed for life through this terrible disease, polio, until they came up with a vaccine. And my father was planning to be a missionary in Africa. He had, I think, 3,000 supporters who were on a mailing list and agreed to pay for him and pray for him as he went to Africa. It was father, mother, and two sons. And just about a year before they were making the big move, overnight, he woke up and couldn't move. He was put in an iron lung. He had no muscular control, couldn't even breathe. So the iron lung would put pressure and then reduce the pressure and force his lungs to move and take in oxygen. It was a charity hospital in Atlanta. He got terrible care, really, and was miserable for several months. And Christians around him said, well, this can't possibly be God's will. God wouldn't want a potential missionary to go through something like this. So they believed that God could heal him and, in fact, would heal him. And against all doctors' advice, they had him removed from the iron lung. There was an article in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution magazine about some evident improvement in the next few days, and they made it sound like a big miracle. When I was 18 when I first saw this article, I didn't know the story behind him being removed from the iron lung against medical advice. But I looked at the date of the newspaper, and it was about 9 days before he died. And my life was changed forever. It guaranteed that we lived in poverty. My mother was not equipped to be a widow. She didn't know how to drive a car. She didn't know how to write a check, a lot of those things. So we had a pretty tough upbringing. And one thing I learned is that not everyone who claims to speak for God does so. If I had been alive and being 1 year old, I couldn't even comprehend these things. But if I had been, say, 10 years old, and somebody said, "Don't you want your father to be healed?" Yeah. Well, don't you believe that prayer does miracles? Yeah. I would have signed on right away, and then I probably would have been crushed and disappointed the rest of my life because my prayer wasn't answered. And that's really not our domain. And I think that's one reason you read the book of Job and God doesn't answer those questions of Job. At the end of the book, God basically says, okay, Job, you've had your time now, 35 chapters worth. And he gives a guided tour of the planet, basically the goodness of the planet. And he chooses these wild animals on the mountaintops and describes them. And, poor Job sitting there scratching his sores, thinking, what does this have to do with me? But God's lesson was, there's some things for you to concern yourself with, and there's some things you can't. And your job is to trust me, even when it looks like I'm untrustworthy. And Job, you barely passed that test, very barely. You just squeaked by, but you didn't curse me. You didn't give up. And my job is to run the universe. And you know what? I'm satisfied. I like the way it's going, and I know how it's going to turn out. So don't try to confuse your job and my job. And that, that's not the kind of methodical answer that we want. But boy, it worked for Job. When he actually saw the mystery of God he immediately said, "I repent in dust and ashes. I have no idea what I was saying."
Hmm.
Uh, and I love that turnaround. It doesn't satisfy, but God says there are some things that are in my domain, and there's some things that in your domain, and you got to trust me, Philip. You have to trust me about your father. Um, when people came to Jesus with that direct question, why was this man born blind? Why did this tower fall on people and kill them? Jesus himself never answered the why questions. He just said, well, that's not your business, really. What you can do is prepare so that if a tower falls on you, you're ready for what's next.
Yeah.
That's the lesson you can take from it. But that's not your domain.
It seems to me that a kind of a prosperity gospel is one way that people have grappled with this question. Another is one that I kind of went through for a while, coming out of, you and I had very similar sorts of backgrounds in many ways in Southern fundamentalism. And when I was a very young man, came to see Calvinism as, for me, it ultimately was a way of kind of swimming out of the sectarianism that I had been into a much broader sort of Christian world, and then kind of outward from there. But at the first part of it, I mean, I remember hearing a preacher. We went to a conference, and a very prominent Reformed theologian said, if there's one molecule that is not being directly controlled by God, then God is not sovereign, which means God is not God. And for a little while, I mean, I remember being 20-something and someone bringing up the problem of evil, and I very flippantly said, what problem of evil? Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. And I look back now and say that, 20-something punk had not ever suffered, had not really, didn't know what he was talking about. But for some people, I think, I remember there was a warning by another preacher at that time that really set with me, because he said, be very careful, people who are trying to explain suffering so easily under the sovereignty of God, that you don't push the problem of evil back into the heart of God. And I remember at that moment, I thought, wow, I think that might be where I'm headed. How do you help somebody who kind of is in that mode of dealing with suffering, in a really, really hyper fatalistic sort of, whatever happens to me is what God is directly doing to me sort of a mindset?
Yeah, yeah. Well, a couple things. Because I write about pain and suffering, I often get called to go to places where people have been through extreme suffering, especially school shootings. I live within 30 minutes of Columbine High School, which kind of started the trend there. And so I've gone to Virginia Tech, and the hardest by far was Newtown, the Sandy Hook killings, where 20 little children, 6 and 7 years old, were mowed down. And I remember so clearly standing in front of the community there 2 nights in a row, more than 1,000 people each time, looking out on these faces just contorted in grief. And there were parents there who lost their children. There were first responders there, teachers at the school. What can I say to these people? And I read them a quote from Richard Dawkins, who said, he said that this planet shows exactly what you would expect in a random place where the world, the universe is a universe of pitiless indifference, blind, pitiless indifference. And I started thinking about that, and I found I find out they don't really the New York Times does not call Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens to address the nation after 9/11 or after Sandy Hook. They go to pastors, priests, and rabbis. And actually, we don't act like this is a universe of blind, pitiless indifference. We care. After 9/11, the New York Times ran an obituary of every one of the almost 3,000 people who died. And it went on for months. They dug up these unknown people and just honored them. Not blind, pitiless indifference, but human compassion and care. And when I stood in front of that group, that grieving group, especially at Sandy Hook, it was important for me, Russell, to be able to say, you grieve, God grieves more. You're not satisfied with what happens on this planet. God is less satisfied. But God is God and has given us the promise that he's going to straighten it out. There is salvation. There is redemption. And I can say to you, because I've studied how Jesus responded to children, I can say to you that Jesus is there comforting your child. Jesus is welcoming your child. That's important for me to be able to say. I too have gone through a period where I've seen some of the extreme Calvinistic perspectives, and they'll say, not a feather falls from a bird that wasn't willed by God. Well, yeah, I mean, in one sense, you're right. It sounds kind of comforting because God is God, but in the other sense, not so much. Jesus didn't go around saying, this is the best of all possible worlds, so enjoy it, get used to it. No, he said, this is my Father's world, but there are some things wrong with it. And I'm going to show you what it will look like one day when justice reigns, when people who don't have food are fed, and people who are abused are freed. That's why I came. He quoted Isaiah in his very first sermon, that the naked shall be clothed, and the hungry are fed, and the sick will be healed. Every one of those is God's way of saying, I'm not finished with this planet yet. Don't judge me. Don't judge the universe by what you see, because I'm not pleased with it, and I plan to do something about it.
I was talking to a scientist one time, a Christian, who went through a real crisis of faith because he had been working a lot in the fossil record and in evolutionary science and so forth. And he said the crisis of faith for him was not how to reconcile this with Genesis. He had an idea of how to do that. His crisis, though, was looking at all of this suffering and death that ultimately led to other things, and concluding it sure looks like what you just mentioned before as what Dawkins would say is a pitiless, random sort of universe, and that kind of put him in a dark night of the soul. Do those things bother you, or do you see them in a different way?
I'm not a scientist. I've seen some great displays of history as science understands it, and human beings are one tiny little sliver. I was attending a lecture by a scientist one time who came out on stage with a roll of toilet paper, and she unrolled the roll of toilet paper all across the stage, and she was making the point of how small human existence on planet Earth, how small that is. These areas, 200 million years were the age of the dinosaurs. No humans at all, reptiles, and then boom, they disappeared almost overnight. And she went through the various stages. And finally, the last pane of toilet paper there, the last little segment, 10% of that, this represents all of human history. So I don't know what it's like to be God, clearly. And what somebody asked, I think it was Richard Rohr, asked the question of a scientist. So if dinosaurs were ruling for 200 million years, what was God doing? What were the dinosaurs doing? Well, the dinosaurs were mostly eating grass. Oh, okay. Well, what was God doing? I guess he was watching dinosaurs eat grass. That's a question none of us can answer. It's a perspective. I do know that God takes delight in His creation. That's what the last part of Job is all about. And I don't know if He was fine tuning some of the DNA or some of the different parts of the biological parts of one species, warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. Who knows? I know He did a pretty amazing job. 400,000 different species of beetles. An inordinate love for beetles, as some skeptics have said. But I don't think anyone knows an answer to that. It's not a pleasant thing to look back on a time when there was survival of the fittest, and not all the dinosaurs are eating grass. Some of them are eating other dinosaurs, mm-hmm. And it's not very pleasant to see. That's one of those mysteries that we don't know about the answer to yet.
One of the books that you wrote that was really helpful to me and influential to me was on grace, mm-hmm. and on the amazingness of grace. And I suppose part of that is because, like you, I came out of an environment that talked a lot about grace in terms of receiving the grace of God, but with a picture of God that often seemed as though He really wanted to condemn us, and was sort of looking to do so unless we found the kind of the contract provision that would keep Him from doing that. And so having this sense of a God who's always kind of alternating between loving me and hating me, that kind of picture of God. And what I've noticed in recent years is an increasing number of people who have that exact same kind of viewpoint. And maybe they don't have it at the intellectual level, but they still have it at the heart level. And I was talking to one of them who said, I understand that God is gracious, but I also understand, I'm reading through the Bible. You read through Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, and even the words of Jesus Himself about people who have a kind of seed that falls on rocky soil kind of faith. And I'm just terrified that when I meet Jesus, knowing all of my sins and all of my flaws, that the answer from Him will be, depart from me, you worker of iniquity, I never knew you. I'm sure you've met people who are in that situation too. How do you guide them through that kind of really deep crisis?
I remember reading an interview that the rock star Bono gave to a skeptical French journalist who was trying to figure out why does this guy hang on to these medieval ideas about God, because Bono is quite open about his faith. And he couldn't understand that. The reporter couldn't. And then Bono said, well, frankly, at the end of it all, you got a choice, karma or grace. And I'd rather go with grace. And I think, Russell, you're absolutely right many people grow up with a karma idea of God. Do something good, you get rewarded. Do something bad, you get punished. And punishment is a form of control and behavior. And in our churches, there were long lists of things that could get you in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the worst heritage we got from that kind of fundamentalist culture is just our idea of God. What is God like? My idea was like a cosmic policeman, someone who's just waiting to smash somebody who does something wrong. And those images from childhood are pretty hard to get over.
Yeah.
And then Jesus came, and I guess I've learned to start with Jesus and end with Jesus. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And Paul and others were clear about that. The exact image of God, Hebrews tells us. This is what God is like. And Jesus he wasn't a pushover by any means, but he was always full of compassion. He was always going for the underdog. He never turned someone away who had an attitude of repentance. And the images he used were things like the good shepherd, taking care of his sheep, the physician, bringing healing to wounds. This is what God is like. Not only that God is willing to, as I think Dorothy Sayers said, take his own medicine. God didn't just look from the heavens down at us on planet Earth and say, well, let them suffer. He joined it. The world had been polluted. It was a good thing spoiled. And Jesus' incarnation, coming to earth, was the first step in overturning that spoiled, to restore creation to what God had in mind in the first place. I read somewhere, I think I have this right, that C.S. Lewis once said, our first words upon entering heaven will be, oh, now I understand. And if you try to draw conclusions from the tainted universe that we can see now, you come up with these kinds of anomalies that are hard to accept and hard to understand.
How do you help people with? There are many people who have seen grace, as some would put it, weaponized,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that I've talked to many survivors, for instance, of church sexual abuse,
Mm-hmm.
who have been told, well, you have to forgive your abuser,
Right.
which often in that context means let this go without accountability. And sometimes you'll have, I've found usually in the harshest, most graceless sorts of environments when it comes to dealing with the outside world, dealing with sinners, you'll often have that use of grace for the people who are on the ends. It's almost like a complete reversal of the way that Jesus is responding to tax collectors and sinners as opposed to the religious leaders. How does somebody know when grace is being misused as a word in their lives?
Yeah, Paul struggled with that constantly in the book of Romans as he's unfolding the kind of the magisterium of theology at the time. This phrase haunts him that he keeps bringing up. And what is to keep a person from abusing grace? And his only answer is, well, God forbid.
Mm-hmm.
I could tell you the answers, but why would you even think of such a thing? If you think you're getting a free pass for doing things that you want to do that displease God, you haven't received God's grace. You don't know what it's all about. It would never occur to you to go around trying to find a way to abuse it, to hurt another person, to perpetuate injustice. And Jesus would always hold out both extremes. When the woman was brought to him, who was caught in the very act of adultery, and the rule was pretty clear in Jewish law, she should be stoned. she should be killed, capital punishment. And I love this passage in John 8 because it's the only time Jesus is depicted as writing. Thing I do for a living, we wouldn't even know that he could write except for this passage. And he was letting the gravity of the situation sink in, I think, just taking some time, writing words on the ground. We don't even know what they were. And then at the end, he said, that whoever is without sin cast the first stone. And there's your dichotomy, the upright religious people who denied sin, and yet Jesus knew their hearts. And one by one crept away. And then the woman who was left, thinking that she was going to be stoned a few minutes ago, he just said, go and sin no more. And that's the balance that we're commanded to show. Jesus beautifully did that, whether it was a man whose son was demon possessed or a woman who had an embarrassing female problem, always responded with grace and compassion. But those who insisted, I'm doing fine on my own, I don't need your help, Jesus. In fact, I'm better than 99% of the people in the world, so I'm doing just fine. And Jesus was pretty harsh toward those people.
You know, as I mentioned before, when I was going through this time of sort of figuring out how to see the graciousness of God in an environment that often didn't really portray that, I had Philip Yancey to read, and Frederick Buechner and C.S. Lewis, and there were some others. The people that were guiding me through that were not people I knew. They were people I was reading at the time. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, you came out of a very similar sort of environment. A lot of people respond to that by losing the faith. You didn't. You became an even deeper Christian, but obviously you didn't have Philip Yancey to read. So I wonder who helped you see the graciousness of God.
Yeah, it wasn't a gospel tract, and it wasn't the Bible. I had devoured those. I was full up to here with that kind of propaganda as I saw it at the time, because I was seeing a lot of discrepancies between what was taught and what people were like. My church was blatantly, sinfully racist. And I was a member of that church, and everybody I knew believed it, and I believed it too. And then I found out later they were wrong. They had lied to me about race, and that was a huge crisis of faith for me. The things that brought me back were not authors, were not words. Three things: nature, the beauties of nature. I found my solace walking through the woods around Atlanta, Georgia, and I had insect collections and wanted to be a biologist when I grew up. So I knew nature well. Music, even though we lived in a tiny little trailer, we had room for a piano, and my brother was amazingly gifted as a musician. And we grew up on classical music, and it was beautiful and calming. And it kind of confirmed to me the chaos of your life is not all there is. There is harmony. There's beauty out there. And then romantic love. So those three things, not words. And what they did, this is a statement that G.K. Chesterton used to quote. He would say, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's the condition I found myself in, because I was experiencing beauty and rest and harmony, and yet, how could that come out of nothing? How could it come out of nowhere? There was an artist behind this world. There was an artist behind romantic love. There was grace. There was beauty. And gradually I thought, I need to know that God. I need to know the Creator who gave us those good gifts, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort. So I was attracted by common grace, I guess the theologians would say. Uh, Not so much a gospel tract for sure, but rather just the awareness that this is a good world. I'd been very aware of the spoiled nature of the world, but now I needed to rediscover the goodness of the world, which is a picture of what we are asked to believe God can do for the entire planet, universe someday.
You know, you've used words to portray this picture for all of your life. I think, if I remember right, for a while you were in a collective, a group that would gather of writers who were Christians. I think included Eugene Peterson and Madeline L'Engle and people like that, sort of an Avengers of a Justice League of Christian writers. And I would have loved to have overheard some of those conversations. I wonder, right now we're at a place where somebody could put into ChatGPT or Claude, write a column in the voice of Philip Yancey about suffering. And it wouldn't be Philip Yancey, but it would be close enough to unnerve a person, and especially as you know that these AI programs are getting better and better at that. Does it worry you that there's a future for human creativity when it comes to writing music too, but to writing words? How should we look at this as we move forward?
Yes, the Authors Guild and organizations like that are now providing a platform on which you can verify that this is written by a human. You'll start to see this on the copyright pages of books very soon. They've got the stamp of veracity. This was written by a human. And I guess I'm glad that I'm as old as I am. At least I lived through a time when there weren't alternatives out there for robot written material. I've listened to some of the songs and some of the music phrases that programs like ChatGPT have come up with, and I would be more afraid as a musician, frankly. When I've read summaries through programs like that, summaries of a book, they're pretty good. They get the basic 5 points down or whatever. But that's not why I read a book. I don't read a book just to memorize 5 things. I read a book to be stirred, to be emotionally affected, to change my way of thinking. It's a meditative process. And I have not seen that yet. I hate to say it won't happen because they used to say that about computers playing chess, and then gradually they took over. But I'm not really. I'm sure there will always be a place for creativity, and I hope we're the master, not the servant. That the program is the servant.
Last question. You're on a desert island the rest of your life. You have no access to anything except for 5 books you can take with you. And you just have a minute to choose them. You're headed out to the island. You could take these 5 books, other than the Bible. What are you going to choose?
Well, somebody asked G.K. Chesterton that question, and he said, why, Jane's Practical Guide to Shipbuilding, of course. So that would be one. That's 2. And then The Great Russians, one from Tolstoy, maybe one from Dostoevsky, and then I guess C.S. Lewis, just because he covers so many kinds of writing, always circling around the theme of his conversion and the new way in which he saw the world. That would keep me busy for a while. You mentioned Frederick Buechner. I love his writing, and I've learned from it and am nourished by it. But that would keep me busy for a while.
Which Tolstoy and which Dostoevsky?
Dostoevsky would have to be Brothers Karamazov and The Idiot, actually.
Yeah.
Those two books. And Tolstoy would have to be, I suppose, War and Peace, just because he's struggling with the Odyssey questions we started this conversation talking about. You know, why is France always invading Russia? You know?
Yeah.
That was the Odyssey question in his day.
Philip Yancey, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Russell.